Welcome to the KIRO Radio Rundown, where we smush all the KIRO Radio hosts into one tiny podcast. Do the KIRO Radio hosts appreciate being smushed in this way? I honestly don't know. I don't think they even know I'm doing this. I'm Jake Rummel. By day, I'm the producer of the Tom and Curley Show, and by night, I do this crazy thing. Every episode, we choose a story or a topic that's been dominating the headlines, either locally or nationally, and we see what each host has to say about it, effectively distilling the entirety of the political spectrum, or at least most of it, into 10 minutes or less. Today's topic, wildfires and climate change. Obviously, I don't need to explain much of this. It's a story that's literally been in the air for like a week now, and it's been miserable. The debate, though, is really about who or what is truly responsible for this. Sure, it's because basically the entire West Coast is on fire, but why does the problem seem to be getting worse? If you ask Governor Jay Inslee...
They're not just wildfires, they're climate fires. They're not caused by an act of God. They're caused by climate change that we have created through our activities as humans.
If you ask President Donald Trump...
You can knock this down to nothing. You know, you go to Europe and different places in Europe, countries where they're forest countries, and they're very, very strong on management, and they don't have a problem. They really don't have, with, as they say, more explosive trees than we have in California.
KIRO Radio hosts grappled with this question in a few ways. Gee Ursula talked to Amy Snover. She's the director of the University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group. Ursula put this question to her pretty simply.
I personally was not in favor of Governor Inslee actually bringing up climate change in relation to the wildfires right now, just because people are still, dealing with the actual disaster itself, here and all across the West. But let's just put that aside. You heard the soundbite of Governor Inslee. This is the worst fire season ever in Washington. Is climate change part of that?
Yes.
Well, that was easy. I'm kidding. Of course, it's not that. It's not that simple. G. Scott went on to push her on this and got her to respond to people who say the fires have nothing to do with climate change.
Yeah, let me give you a little analogy. Okay, so there's a lot of factors that are contributing to fires, right? There is no one single factor that has caused these, and so we could list some of them. If you're going to have fires, you got to have something to burn, right? And so there's a lot of trees and fuel in the forest, and much of that's a result of fire suppression over the past 50 years or so. So there's more fuels to burn. So that's one cause of it. Mm-hmm. You need something to start the fire, right? And we've seen that, especially recently, a lot of the fires have been human caused, right. And a lot of that's just by normal things that people do that they really shouldn't be doing, but, leaving a campfire burning or driving onto the grass or all kinds of other. So you need an ignition. And you also need that fuel to be dry. Okay. And that's where climate change comes in, is that it's made the world hotter and drier. And so it increases the risk of fires, and it increases the risk that they'll be larger. So all of those things are factors in almost all fires now. And so, people like to spend a lot of time arguing it's one or the other of those factors. And that's really kind of a waste of time in my mind, because it's all of them.
Dori Monson, he's on right after Gee and Ursula get done, also talked to UW scientist, and that was regionally renowned meteorologist Cliff Mass. I found this really interesting because he brings up an entirely different factor that I hadn't heard about.
One important thing you have to keep in mind is you have to talk about what fires you're looking at, okay? Because different fires in different places have different origins, okay? So the fires that we care most about the last week are the fires on the western side of the Oregon Cascades. Mm-hmm. Now, those fires were forced by extraordinarily unusual easterly winds from the east, great strength and persistence. And in fact, I was looking at that myself. It hasn't happened in 50, 70 years, as far as back as the records go. So it's very unusual. Now, here's the interesting thing. These fires, like all fires on the western side, are all associated with strong easterly winds. Mm-hmm. Our climate change models, suggest that these winds will get less likely into climate change. So not only does Jay Inslee have it wrong, but he has it wrong by 180 degrees.
Well, it also strikes me. I was doing some research this morning on what was called the Big Burn of 1910, which was a devastating wildfire that hit eastern Washington and Idaho. And all of these things, and we have had extraordinary, tragic events long before we had the internal combustion engine. And it just seems that, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but politicians turning this into nothing but politics, I find that disgusting, because we have had over the centuries, over the millennia, devastating events like this, and certainly before we had the type of carbon burn that we have in 2020. What's your take on all of that?
Well, I mean, that's another issue. Wildfire is natural to the western United States.
Sure.
And in fact, wildfires were actually much more frequent if you go back 100 years, 150 years ago than now. What we did during the 1920s and 1930s, in that period, we started a real interesting experiment. We started suppressing fire. And we did that on a massive scale. We really lowered the number of fires. But that had a very unfortunate effect. We completely changed our forests, and they've become much more dense. They have all kinds of scrubby little trees underneath, and the remains of past logging and whatever. And so our forests now are much more prone to burn, and burn catastrophically.
So far, we're keeping it chronological. Tom and John are on for your afternoon drive. They actually heard the Cliff Mass clip from Dori's show and kind of got into a back and forth on the science behind that, along with reporter Hannah Scott.
I love yesterday, Cliff Mass was the one that just put a giant hand right in Inslee's masked face and says, no, actually, it's very unusual that we get east winds, and when the climate change increases, this is Cliff Mass, a meteorologist, by the way, Cliff Mass said, no, when climate change...
Yes.
What's controversial? Cliff Mass's? His science?
Yes,
No. His science is controversial?
Dr. Raymond, who was on today's press conference, was asked about the winds, and essentially what she said is that there's no really agreed upon science regarding the wind and climate change and how that relates. So really, again, they're talking about the drier brush and the weather, the heat, and things like that.
It's great that scientists can debate.
Yes.
By the way, I love Cliff Mass. I didn't want that to come off as like an attack on Cliff Mass.
No, I think you
He's
described
controversial.
Him as,
yes,
think was
controversial.
The word. Yeah, controversial. Yeah,
controversial.
Yeah, right.
Yes, and he is.
Well, does that discredit him, Tom? When someone is controversial, meaning they go against the norm, or they're not just parroting something like that woman that was in there with Inslee, right? So you want to get the scientist that supports your political points of view. But when your scientist does not present the political points of view, then he's considered controversial.
Well, no, he's a controversial figure for other things.
Oh, okay.
At the radio stations. I've met Cliff Mass. I sat in on a class of his. I'm a big fan of Cliff Mass.
Good.
The thing is that he does take controversial political positions sometimes.
Now, finally, we'll flip back to Dave Ross of Seattle's Morning News. He actually tried to thread a needle and find a way to make climate change activists and the forest managers happy.
What if there was a solution that involved removing wide swaths of timber to prevent fires, which the president wants, and then using that wood to cut carbon emissions? In California yesterday, the president mentioned that Scandinavian countries carefully manage their forests, which they do. But when I looked it up, I found that they're also trying something else.
It turns out that cities of the future might be built out of wood. A wave of architects are embracing wood as the building material of the moment.
Yes, wooden skyscrapers using new wood laminates as strong and as fireproof as steel, but which also keep carbon out of the atmosphere because that's what wood does.
One study showed that using wood to construct a 125-meter skyscraper could reduce the building's carbon footprint by up to 75%.
In fact, Norway already has an 18-story wood skyscraper, and there are plans for a 70-story version in Tokyo. So the answer looks clear to me. Go ahead, clear those fire breaks to make Trump happy, and then use all that wood to trap the carbon forever in wooden skyscrapers. Heck, I bet IKEA could snap one together in an afternoon. Earth saved.
So that's the KIRO Radio Rundown for September 17th, 2020. Thanks for listening. You don't always have time to listen to every KIRO Radio show, but you'll always have time for the KIRO Rundown. See you on Tuesday.